Legal liability. Nursing practice is governed by many legal concepts. It is important for nurses to know the basics of legal concepts, because nurses are accountable for their professional judgments and actions. Accountability is an essential concept of professional nursing practice and the law. Knowledge of laws that regulate and affect nursing practice is needed for two reasons. First, to ensure that the nurse's decisions and actions are consistent with current legal principles. And second, to protect the nurse from liability. Laws. Law can be defined as the sum total of rules and regulations by which a society is governed. As such, law is created by people and exists to regulate all persons. Nurses are governed by civil and criminal law in roles as providers of services, employees of institutions, and private citizens. A nurse has a personal and legal obligation to provide a standard of client care expected of a reasonably competent professional nurse. Professional nurses are held responsible, liable, for harm resulting from their negligent acts or their failure to act. The law serves a number of functions in nursing. It provides a framework for establishing which nursing actions in the care of clients are legal. It differentiates the nurse's responsibilities from those of other health professionals. It helps establish the boundaries of independent nursing action. It assists in maintaining a standard of nursing practice by making nurses accountable under the law. Types of law applicable to nurses. Laws can be further classified into different types. Civil law. Standard of proof is preponderance of the evidence. Private law, or civil law, is the body of law that deals with relationships among private individuals. It can be categorized into a variety of legal specialties such as contract law and tort law. Contracts. It is a nurse-patient relationship. Contract law involves the enforcement of agreements among private individuals or the payment of compensation for failure to fulfill agreements. Torts. Tort law defines and enforces duties and rights among private individuals that are not based on contractual agreements. Intentional tort. Action is substantially certain to cause an effect. Sources of law. The legal system in the United States has its origin in the English common law system. Provides an overview of the primary sources of law, example, how laws are created, constitutions, statutes, administrative agencies, and decisions of courts, common law. The Constitution. The Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the country. It establishes the general organization of the federal government, grants certain powers to the government, and places limits on what federal and state governments may do. A constitution creates legal rights and responsibilities and is the foundation for a system of justice. For example, the U.S. Constitution ensures each U.S. citizen the right to due process of law. Legislative branch. Laws enacted by any legislative body are called statutory laws. When federal and state laws conflict, federal law supersedes. Likewise, state laws supersede local laws. The regulation of nursing is a function of state law. State legislatures pass statutes that define and regulate nursing, that is, nurse practice acts. These acts, however, must be consistent with constitutional and federal provisions. Clinical alert. It is important for nurses to keep their legislators informed about nursing because it is the legislature that passes laws that affect nursing practice. Judicial branch. Laws evolving from court decisions are referred to as common law. In addition to interpreting and applying constitutional or statutory law, courts also are asked to resolve disputes between two parties. Common law is continually being adapted and expanded. In deciding specific controversies, courts generally adhere to the doctrine of stare decisis. To stand by things decided. Usually referred to as following precedent. In other words, to arrive at a ruling in a particular case, the court applies the same rules and principles applied in previous, similar cases. Executive branch. Administrative law. When a state legislature passes a statute, an administrative agency is given the authority to create rules and regulations to enforce the statutory laws. For example, state boards of nursing write rules and regulations to implement and enforce a Nurse Practice Act, which was created through statutory law. Types of law applicable to nurses. Laws can be further classified into different types. Civil law. Standard of proof is preponderance of the evidence. Private law, or civil law, is the body of law that deals with relationships among private individuals. It can be categorized into a variety of legal specialties such as contract law and tort law. Contracts. It is a nurse-patient relationship. Contract law involves the enforcement of agreements among private individuals or the payment of compensation for failure to fulfill agreements. Torts. Tort law defines and enforces duties and rights among private individuals that are not based on contractual agreements. Intentional tort. Action is substantially certain to cause an effect. Fraud. Fraud is willful and purposeful misrepresentation that could cause, or has caused, loss or harm to a person or property. Misrepresentation of a product is a common fraudulent act. A person fraudulently misrepresenting himself or herself to obtain a license to practice nursing may be prosecuted under the state's Nurse Practice Act. Also, misrepresenting the outcome of a procedure or treatment may constitute fraud. Defamation. Defamation is communication that is false, or made with a careless disregard for the truth, and results in injury to the reputation of a person. Both libel and slander are wrongful actions that come under the heading of defamation. Libel is defamation by means of print, writing, or pictures. Writing in the nurse's notes that a primary care provider is incompetent because he did not respond immediately to a call is an example of libel. Slander is defamation by the spoken word, stating unprivileged, not legally protected, or false words by which a reputation is damaged. An example of slander would be for the nurse to tell a client that another nurse is incompetent. Only the person defamed may bring the lawsuit. The defamatory material must be communicated to a third party such that the person's reputation may be harmed. For example, a comment made in private criticizing that person's competence is not defamation since a third party did not hear it. Nurses have a qualified privilege to make statements that could be considered defamatory, but only as a part of nursing practice and only to a primary care provider or another health team member caring directly for the client. The communication must be made in good faith with the intent to protect the quality of client care. For example, when a nurse manager provides a prospective employer with information about a nurse's professional practice. Assault and battery. The terms assault and battery are often heard together, but each has its own meaning. Assault can be described as an attempt or threat to touch another person unjustifiably. Assault precedes battery. It is the act that causes the person to believe a battery is about to occur. For example, the person who threatens someone by making a menacing gesture with a club or a closed fist is guilty of assault. A nurse who threatens a client with an injection after the client refuses to take the medication orally would be committing assault. Battery is the willful touching of a person, or the person's clothes, or even something the person is carrying, that may or may not cause harm. To be actionable at law, however, the touching must be wrong in some way, for example, touching done without permission, that is embarrassing, or that causes injury. In the previous example, if the nurse followed through on the threat and gave the injection without the client's consent, the nurse would be committing battery. Liability applies even though the primary care provider ordered the medication or the activity, and even if the client benefits from the nurse's action. Consent is required before procedures are performed. Battery exists when there is no consent, even if the plaintiff was not asked for consent. Unless there is implied consent, such as in life-threatening emergencies, a procedure performed on an unconscious client without informed consent is battery. Another requirement for consent is that the client be competent to give consent. It can be very difficult to determine if clients who are older, who have specific mental disorders, or who take particular medications are competent to agree to treatments. If the nurse is uncertain whether a client refusing a treatment is competent, the supervisor and primary care provider should be consulted so that ethical treatment that does not constitute battery can be provided. Determination of competency is not a medical decision, it is one made through court hearings. False imprisonment. False imprisonment is the unjustifiable detention of a person without legal warrant to confine the person. False imprisonment accompanied by forceful restraint or threat of restraint is battery. Although nurses may suggest under certain circumstances that a client remain in the hospital room or in bed, the client must not be detained against the client's will. The client has a right to insist on leaving even though it may be detrimental to health. In this instance, the client can leave by signing an AWA, absence without authority, or AMA, against medical advice, form. As with assault or battery, client competency is a factor in determining whether there is a case of false imprisonment or a situation of protecting a client from injury. To guide nurses in such dilemmas, agencies usually have clear policies regarding the application of restraints. Invasion of privacy. Invasion of privacy is a direct wrong of a personal nature. It injures the feelings of the person and does not take into account the effect of revealed information on the reputation of the person in the community. The right to privacy is the right of individuals to withhold themselves and their lives from public scrutiny. It can also be described as the right to be left alone. Liability can result if the nurse breaches confidentiality by passing along confidential client information to others or intrudes into the client's private domain. In this context, a delicate balance must be maintained between the need of a number of people to contribute to the diagnosis and treatment of a client and the client's right to confidentiality. In most situations, necessary discussion about a client's medical condition is considered appropriate, but unnecessary discussions and gossip are considered breaches of confidentiality. Necessary discussion involves only those people engaged in the client's care. Clinical alert. Never discuss client situations in the elevator, cafeteria, or other public areas. Unintentional tort. It is a violation of standard of care. Negligence and malpractice. We will discuss about this later. Criminal law. Standard of proof is guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Public law refers to the body of law that deals with relationships between individuals and the government and governmental agencies. An important segment of public law is criminal law, which deals with actions against the safety and welfare of the public. Examples are homicide, manslaughter, and theft. Crimes can be classified as either felonies or misdemeanors. A crime is an act committed in violation of public, criminal, law and punishable by a fine or imprisonment. A crime does not have to be intentional in order to be a crime. For example, a nurse may accidentally give a client an additional and lethal dose of a narcotic to relieve discomfort. Felony. A felony is a crime of a serious nature, such as murder, punishable by a term in prison. Manslaughter. In some areas, second-degree murder is called manslaughter. A nurse who accidentally gives an additional and lethal dose of a narcotic can be accused of manslaughter. Assault and battery and fraud. Misdemeanor. Crimes are punished through criminal action by the state against an individual. A misdemeanor is an offense of a less serious nature and is usually punishable by a fine or short-term jail sentence, or both. Negligence and malpractice. Negligence is conduct that falls below the standard of care. Negligence can include acts of commission and acts of omission. A nurse who does not meet appropriate standards of care may be held liable. Negligence and professional negligence are examples of unintentional torts that may occur in the healthcare setting. Negligence is misconduct or practice that is below the standard expected of an ordinary, reasonable, and prudent person. Such conduct places another person at risk for harm. Both non-medical and professional individuals can be liable for negligent acts. Gross negligence involves extreme lack of knowledge, skill, or decision-making that the person clearly should have known would put others at risk for harm. Negligent acts. Medication errors that result in injury to the client. Intravenous administration errors such as incorrect flow rates or failure to monitor a flow rate that results in injury to the client. Falls that occur as a result of failure to provide safety to the client. Failure to use sterile technique when indicated. Failure to check equipment for proper functioning. Burns sustained by the client as a result of failure to monitor bath temperature or equipment. Failure to monitor a client's condition. Failure to report changes in the client's condition to the physician. Failure to provide a complete report to the oncoming nursing staff. Malpractice is negligence on the part of a nurse. Malpractice is determined if the nurse owed a duty to the client and did not carry out the duty, and the client was injured because the nurse failed to perform the duty. Malpractice is professional negligence, that is, negligence that occurred while the person was performing as a professional. Malpractice applies to primary care providers, dentists, lawyers, and generally includes nurses. In some states, nurses cannot be sued for malpractice, only professional negligence. The terms malpractice and professional negligence are often used interchangeably. Proof of liability. 6 elements must be present for a case of nursing professional negligence to be proven. Duty. At the time of injury, a duty existed between the plaintiff and the defendant. The nurse must have, or should have had, a relationship with the client that involves providing care and following an acceptable standard of care. Such duty, for example, is evident when the nurse has been assigned to care for a client in the home or hospital. A nurse also has a general duty of care, even if not specifically assigned to a client, if the client needs help. Clinical alert. It is a nurse's duty to respond to all clients' call lights, not just those of assigned clients. Breach of duty. The defendant breached duty of care to the plaintiff. There must be a standard of care that is expected in the specific situation but that the nurse did not observe. For example, something was done that should not have been done or nothing was done when it should have been done. This is the failure to act as a reasonable, prudent nurse under the circumstances. The standard can come from documents published by national or professional organizations, boards of nursing, institutional policies and procedures, or textbooks or journals, or it may be stated by expert witnesses. Foreseeability. A link must exist between the nurse's act and the injury suffered. Proximate cause. The breach of the duty was the legal cause of injury to the client. It must be proved that the harm occurred as a direct result of the nurse's failure to follow the standard of care and that the nurse could have, or should have, known that failure to follow the standard of care could result in such harm. Damage or injury. The plaintiff experienced injury or damages or both and can be compensated by law. Damages. If professional negligence caused the injury, the nurse is held liable for damages that may be compensated. The goal of awarding damages is to assist the injured party to his or her original position as far as financially possible. Harm or injury. The client or plaintiff must demonstrate some type of harm or injury, physical, financial, or emotional, as a result of the breach of duty owed the client. The plaintiff will be asked to document physical injury, medical costs, loss of wages, pain and suffering, and any other damages. Reminder. The nurse must meet appropriate standards of care when delivering care to the client, otherwise the nurse would be held liable if the client is harmed. Professional liability insurance. Nurses need their own liability insurance for protection against malpractice lawsuits. Having their own insurance provides nurses protection as individuals. This allows a nurse to have an attorney present who has only the nurse's interests in mind. Because of the increase in the number of professional negligence lawsuits against health professionals, nurses are advised to carry their own liability insurance. Most hospitals have liability insurance that covers all employees, including all nurses. However, some smaller facilities, such as walk-in clinics, may not. Thus, the nurse should always check with the employer at the time of hiring to see what coverage the facility provides. A primary care provider or a hospital can be sued because of the negligent conduct of a nurse, and the nurse can also be sued and held liable for professional negligence. Because hospitals have been known to countersue nurses when they have been found negligent and the hospital was required to pay, nurses are advised to provide their own insurance coverage and not rely on hospital-provided insurance. Additionally, nurses often provide nursing services outside of employment-related activities, such as being available for first aid at children's sport or social activities or providing health screening and education at health fairs. Neighbors or friends may seek advice about illnesses or treatment for themselves or family members. In the latter situation, the nurse may be tempted to give advice. However, it is always advisable for the nurse to refer the friend or neighbor to their family primary care provider. The nurse may be protected from liability under Good Samaritan Acts when nursing service is volunteered. However, if the nurse receives any compensation or if there is a written or verbal agreement outlining the nurse's responsibility to the group, the nurse needs liability coverage for legal expenses in the event that the nurse is sued. Liability insurance coverage usually defrays all costs of defending a nurse, including the costs of retaining an attorney. The insurance also covers all costs incurred by the nurse up to the face value of the policy, including a settlement made out of court. In return, the insurance company may have the right to make the decisions about the claim and the settlement. Nursing faculty and nursing students are also vulnerable to lawsuits. Students and teachers of nursing employed by community colleges and universities are not likely to be covered by the insurance carried by hospitals and health agencies. It is advisable for nursing students to check with their school about the coverage that applies to them. Increasingly, faculty carry their own professional liability insurance. Liability insurance can be obtained through the ANA or private insurance companies. Nursing students can also obtain insurance through the National Student Nurses Association. In some states, hospitals do not allow nursing students to provide nursing care without liability insurance or a signed disclaimer placing the responsibility of the student's actions while in the clinical setting on the student. Good Samaritan laws. State legislatures pass Good Samaritan laws, which may vary from state to state. These laws encourage healthcare professionals to assist in emergency situations and limit liability, and offer legal immunity for persons helping in an emergency, provided that they give reasonable care. Immunity from suit applies only when all conditions of the state law are met, such as the healthcare provider receives no compensation for the care provided, and the care given is not intentionally negligent. Good Samaritan Acts are laws designed to protect healthcare providers who provide assistance at the scene of an emergency against claims of professional negligence, unless it can be shown that there was a gross departure from the normal standard of care or willful wrongdoing on their part. Gross negligence usually involves further injury or harm to the person. For example, an automobile may strike an injured child, left on the side of the road when the nurse leaves to obtain help. Most state statutes do not require citizens to render aid to people in distress. Such assistance is considered more of an ethical than a legal duty. To encourage citizens to be good Samaritans, most states have now enacted legislation releasing a Good Samaritan from legal liability for injuries caused under such circumstances, even if the injuries resulted from negligence of the person offering emergency aid. It is important, however, to check your state's statute since some states require people to stop and aid persons in danger. It is generally believed that a person who renders help in an emergency, at a level that would be provided by any reasonably prudent person under similar circumstances, cannot be held liable. The same reasoning applies to nurses, who are among the people best prepared to help at the scene of an accident. If the level of care a nurse provides is of the caliber that would have been provided by any other nurse, then the nurse will not be held liable. Controlled substances. The nurse should adhere to facility policies and procedures concerning administration of controlled substances, which are governed by federal and state laws. Controlled substances must be kept locked securely, and only authorized personnel should have access to them. U.S. laws regulate the distribution and use of controlled substances such as narcotics, depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens. Misuse of controlled substances leads to criminal penalties.